Good morning, and thank you very much for having me here. Today is a good day for many different reasons, but of course, one of which is just our gathering makes it a good day. This morning, I saw someone writing, "Oh, the date is 02020202." Just keeps recurring. Your virtual Groundhog Day, right? Which is good, and apparently the signs are early spring, but I don't know what that means in Chicago because there never really is a spring anyway. Anyway, yeah. Okay, so today I kind of working with the title Africans in the Bible, particularly because I want to emphasize both the latter more than the former, because ultimately one of the things that the point I want to make is how our geographical orientation impacts our reading of the Bible. And because we are reading texts with very, very sparse descriptions, it's difficult for us to identify who is whom, except by what the Bible tends to use, place origins. So where a person comes from is in some ways an indicator of who that individual is. So it's hard to identify Africans without at the same time figuring out which geographical portions of Africa are being represented in the text itself. So I will spend a little bit more time on the geography rather than the characters itself. So to begin with, I want us to reconcept, so here are the four main things I will say. This is a nice thing about this, right? The four big points I want to cover in 40 minutes or so. Let's start with reconceptualizing geography, because this becomes a very important point for us to start with in terms of how our concept of geography has been shaped. Now, if you look at a map of the world, the portion of the world that we're dealing with that's shaded green in this map has been called very different things. East tends to be the the term that's there. It's the Middle East. In biblical study, it tends to be called the ancient Near East. There are conceptions of the Far East. Well, when you have a globe, you can't find East and West easily unless you have a very fixed point. And the fixed point tends to be Western Europe, right? The Greenwich Meridian, London, etc., etc. So any kinds of geographical orientations that we have, global geographical orientations, tend to privilege Western Europe. They are in effect the imposition of a Western European view of the world upon everything, and that tends to shape and color things. So this issue of the East and the area that the biblical narrative takes place in tends to be subject to this thing called Orientalism. There's this wonderful book by Edward Said called Orientalism, where it is not just a geographical location but a cultural construction as well. How the West constructs who belongs there, what these people are, what the cultures are, etc., etc., and those sorts of things are in some ways what we're dealing with. One of the intriguing things then that we have noticed in biblical studies, and by biblical studies I'm going to talk, I here mean the study of the Bible in a particular, as a discipline that starts around the early 19th century, is that the biblical world is somewhat positioned in the culture of Arabs, and Arabs as a sort of a cultural expression becomes absolutely vague in the European imagination. But it is also a malleable conception, because what you will see is Europeans are going to appropriate the biblical narratives as their narratives, so that ancient Israel are precursors of British identity, of France, Germans. Right? Several European countries will kind of see their origins through ancient Israel. And those origins are a little murky because, as you know, myths of origins are all just exactly what they are, myths. They're never real. They're never historically accurate. They are just stories people tell to convince themselves that they're good or they're better or all of these other things. So a number of the sort of national myths of Europeans place them as continuities of ancient Israel. Of course, which is problematic genetically, right? If the origins are Arabs, so then how do you end up with white people out of all of that? It's precisely because the murkiness of the designation of Arabs allows that, and some other kinds of representations as well. So part of the thing that we're beginning with, that we have to contend with, is that when we read the Bible, the fact that culture, physical identities, places of origins are all murky or all in a kind of a soup that is then in some ways adapted, manipulated, obscured through the scholarship, this is the place we need to begin with to understand how does Africa fit into that. Because part of the thing that we're dealing with in biblical studies is the same dilemma that's faced with how Western historiography, Western scholarship, Western knowledge constructs Africa as a sort of a nowhere place. And that becomes important for us as we move on. So let's talk about how Africa then fits into the biblical world itself. And I thought I had a map here as well, because one of the things I wanted to talk about would be, go to African spaces. That's where I think I'll go. Yeah. Part of this is if you look at the map of Africa, and it's not until maybe the 1960s, 1970s that you had scholars contending, you need to think of Egypt as Africa. You need to think of Libya as that, because up until that point in time, a lot of Western scholarship did not place Egypt in Africa. Geographically, culturally, and in many other ways. And if you're having that, and I'm seeing some looks of surprise on people's faces, if you have that conception in the scholarship, anyone who is a good reader of the Bible and sees Egypt doesn't think Africa. And therefore excludes it from that conception. The other, and of course, you know from reading the Bible, Egypt is a big player within the biblical narrative, right? So that's, I mean, if you get that, then you get most of what I'm trying to make. The geographical spaces, then you start to ask, who are Egyptians? Who are the Egyptian characters in this narrative? Why is this thing taking place in Egypt, etc., etc.? And you cannot escape the fact that from the very get-go in the book of Genesis right into Matthew, Egypt has always functioned as this place of refuge. People who need to be saved and rescued and protected, they go to Egypt. Anyway, right? So here's another place that I want us to get in our minds that comes up very, very prominently in the biblical narrative. And it depends upon the English language translation that you're using. And that place name is Cush. And it has an important space within the Bible, and a problematic way of dealing with it. As best as we could understand, the ancient mind that uses the term Cush is referring to the entire Nile Valley south of Egypt, including Nubia and Abyssinia. And these are ancient terms as well for certain place names. Nubia, as best as sort of approximates to modern-day Sudan, and Abyssinia was an old term for the ancient kingdom of Ethiopia. So what you will find is that some English translations will use the term Ethiopia. And that's the word that you will see very, very often, where Ethiopia equals, Cush equals Ethiopia. it is very clear that by when the term Ethiopia is used in the biblical text, that they're referring to people that are Africans. And by Africans, I definitely mean people who are phenotypically Africans. As early as the 9th century BCE, Homer understands Ethiopia as a place where what he refers to, the term Ethiopia equals land of the people of burnt faces. That is, these were people whose skin were much darker than ours, as Homer is trying to think of it. And in his mind, he's thinking of Egypt, he's thinking of Nubia, he's thinking of India. Those were the thing, darker skinned people. And the limited geographical sense at that knowledge at that time was that Ethiopia was south, right? Everything south of Europe was Ethiopia. And why were these people's skins darker? Homer and Greek thinkers thought, oh, because the southern part of the earth is closer to the sun. They live closer to the sun, therefore their skin is darker, right? Into that mix, of course, was the sense that the southern part, which eventually Europeans started to call Africa, and most of their knowledge went as far as just somewhere south of the Sahara, didn't conceptualize a bigger continent, was that this was the furthest reaches of livable space, that there was nothing beyond that. The furthest outposts. They live in the places, as some would say, where the sun goes down and where the sun rises. So that was a knowledge conception. So if this is involved in Greek, in the Greek scholarship in early 9th century BCE, we could conclude this term Cush, when it's used in biblical texts written much later, under the influence of Greek scholarship and so on, that's who they're conceptualizing. Phenotypical Africans, darker skin people. And some of you might know the work of Martin Bernal, who, a scholar from, again, 1970s and so on. He wrote this phenomenal book called Black Athena, and tracing the sort of African origins of Greek knowledge and Greek art and sculpture and so on, and showing the representations of darker skinned people in Greek art and Greek urns and that sort of a thing. Cush then, or Ethiopia, or Nubia, depends on the translation that you have, turns up as a very, very dominant space in the book of, in the Bible. So let's take a little closer look at the biblical Cush. If you go back to that one. Yes, see what I have there is biblical Cush. Yep, we got that. And references, of course, I have a reference there to the book of Job, where Egypt and several nations are trading with Cush, because it's an important economic force in the region. Where is Cush? If you go back to biblical spaces, let's show you what I'm referring to here. African spaces. And click on the right, the bottom right. Yeah. So that below, this is a modern map. Below Egypt, it will be Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia. That's the guess that many people approximate as to the ancient kingdom of Cush, that particular portion of Africa. So essentially what I'm trying to work with is the space from Egypt all the way down to the Horn of Africa that then appears in biblical narratives with characters, with spaces, as places from which people trade. And that's an important thing. But I also want you to get into your head where, modern Israel is not too far from where ancient Israel was. The relationship in terms of the spaces that's there. A very sort of quick word on sort of geopolitical power in the ancient world. a lot of the geopolitical power was balanced between Egypt and the Mesopotamia Valley. So what is modern-day Iraq or Iran? Okay? Iran as the sort of modern descendants of the Persian Empire, Iraq as a space that housed the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire. These were the major political players, and Egypt was their main rival. Either one, any of those Mesopotamian empires jostled with Egypt for dominance of the Syria-Palestine region and the entire region and access to the Mediterranean as a result of it. So that in terms of the proximity of Egypt and then these other spaces as well, the Kush region, these become significant and important geographical spaces, and the nations, they become important players for the balance of power in that what I will call a sandwich region, because then the biblical world is set in the middle of all of these big empires, and they become the ants when the elephants are jumping around. Okay? Right. Very good. So great. Some more on Kush. Let's go further. So the point I want to make is that there is enough. Yeah, keep going. Let's see. No. Yep, this is the ancient picture. Put is another one that I don't bring up a lot of material on Put in this presentation, but again, North African space that's represented in some ways in the Bible, and Put is modern-day Libya. You will see there are not too many characters. That's why I'm not stressing it that much. But ever at all, you run across some of those wonderfully obscure Old Testament passages where you see the word put, and it's not a verb, it's North Africa. Okay, all right. And let's see where I go. Okay, I think we need to move on to the next, right, African locations in the Bible. I spent more time there. Yeah. So one of the things I have listed there, and it's on your handout, are the numerous mentions of Cush. And I don't put all of them. I don't put all of them because the point that I'm trying to make is that Cush is a major player, a significant player in the Bible as a commercial trading partner, dating back as early to the time of Solomon. And then we have several Cushites, Nubians, Ethiopians, depending on your translations, who are mentioned in the Bible, and I'll come back around to some of these in the last section of the presentation. But there's an interesting thing about geography that we need to pay attention to, and as it relates to the primeval river. This strange map here is a recreation of the description of the Garden of Eden in Genesis chapter 2. In Genesis chapter 2, we are told that 4 rivers flow out of the Garden of Eden. One is called the Tigris, one is called the Euphrates, right? Quite obvious. But then the other 2, one is called the Gihon, and no one ever knows that there's a river called the Gihon. There's a spring, but there's no river called it. And then there's another one that flows to land called Cush. The problem with this description is that it is just geographically impossible, right? Now, what many people who go in search of the Garden of Eden do, right? There have been those people, and there still are those people who, I want to find where the Garden of Eden is. They try to reconstruct it from this, and it is impossible, because the question is, this river that's flowing into the land of Cush, many people think, oh, it's going to Mesopotamia. Not necessarily so, right? Again, because it comes out of the construction that Cush is not African, or that Africa doesn't impact the biblical world, and it picks up on a very misunderstood notion of Cush in Genesis chapter 10. Well, this is the problem. when people try to use the Bible as a scientific source, because it's never accurate. The sources aren't consistent in many ways. So in Genesis chapter 10, Cush is presented as an ancestor of the Assyrians, and so they go looking in that area. When in fact, if we position Cush in Africa, right, south of the Nile, then, well, I am not necessarily among those who would say, well, the Garden of Eden is going to be in Africa. Well, if you want to go look in Africa for it, fine, go. Whether you find it or not, I'm not too interested. But what I want what I'm trying to point out is that there are a number of ethnocentric impulses that would deny places or events or occurrences in Africa because, wow, no, Africa has nothing to do with the Bible. So that it's easy to dismiss stuff, even when you have some other material pushing you in that direction. It's the sense of, no, can't belong there. It has to be here. Let's go looking here. And let's use the very murky knowledge that's already there, okay? One more thing I want to set up is the Table of Nations, which is what I was referring to earlier in terms of Cush and as an ancestor of the Assyrians. Genesis chapter 10 I have found to be a very intriguing portion of the Bible, and it's one that I would encourage you to spend some time with. It is a little not exciting reading, but it's very interesting reading because what it is a genealogical list, and what it sets out to do is to say this is where the people of the world come from. It happens after the flood, and therefore it tries to create a chart by saying the entire world was populated by the survivors of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, Japheth. And so what it does is to take each son and then try to put out who their ancestors are, etc., etc. The other important thing about the Table of Nations is the Table of Nations is what provides biblical support for racial theories. Because it is this conception then that one son, and again, this is how these myths of origins don't always make sense. Because essentially what the claim is, race theory, early race theory is, we got different races from one common ancestor, right? Noah being that, so therefore somehow one son of Moses produces white people, another one produces black people, and another one produces Asian people. Right? So so 17th century race theories are drawing on Genesis chapter 10. And this is why I find it very, very fascinating. And while, there have been more sophisticated use of that information, and quite a bit of race theories still don't go very far from those conceptions. Right? That somehow or the other, right. I'm going to go further afield from what's going on there. But part of it is how you will see the designation of the descendants, Egypt, Cush, and Canaan, as coming out of one particular son. The sons of Ham, that is, producing Cush, Put, and Canaan. And in that blue section, if you pay attention to it, one of the important things I want to stress is the way in which Genesis 10 does not provide the kind of basic support for these theories about the curse of Ham that again becomes a very important subtext and, not even just subtext, claim for the inferiority of people of African descent. Because essentially what Genesis 10 is going to talk about are who then creates civilizations in certain places, who then are responsible. In fact, as you go through the rest of the biblical text, when Ham is mentioned or or descendants of Ham are mentioned, you don't see any of those, the kinds of negativity that that certain people claim exists in Genesis chapter 9. In fact, in Genesis chapter 9, Ham is not cursed. It's Canaan who is cursed. And then the connection is, oh, well, because one has to force it. You have to force the logic. Well, if Canaan is the one, if Ham is the one who saw the father's nakedness because he was drunk, again, how do you validate a curse that comes out of somebody waking up drunk, right? That somehow or the other that makes sense. But anyway, that's another thing. Essentially, when we get the narrative of cursed be, it's never cursed be Ham, it's cursed be Canaan. Right? So anyway, so the logic of chapter 9, on the basis upon which the notion of the curse of Ham is provided, is suspect, and we don't see any kind of negativity related to Hamites much later on. Okay? In fact, what I'm trying to put out there when those categories called wealth of nations, African wisdom, points of comparisons, etc., are ways in which in biblical text you will see us. I want to be very guarded here. What you will see is a measured sense of appreciation for African cultures, African resources, and African peoples. Is the point that I would want to make. These become extremely important for our thinking, primarily because myths can be sustained based upon the prevalence of ignorance. So it's the sense of, well, you don't know who Africans are in the Bible anyway. And if you obscure and erase the African presence from the Bible, then it's very easy to say that race is cursed. Do you see them in the Bible? Do you see them doing great things? Do you see positive things about them? No, right? And of course, given where some of this material is coming from, they're not coming out of narratives, right? The most exciting things to read, right? Some of it they come out of lists. They come from lists of where are ancient Israel and Judah getting their material from? Where does the building of the temple, the building materials come from, right? They come from all over the region, right? Some of it in the Syria-Palestine region, the cedars, the building cedars come from Lebanon. But parts of the gold and so on are coming from that Cushite region that I'm showing you. Whether or not that is the case, I don't actually know. But what it reveals to me is somebody knew that sources of certain resources came from particular places, right? So whether Solomon sourced them from that point or not, it's the sense of someone is constructing a story who is aware. If we were to build a magnificent building, this is where we would go to get them. And so you're seeing African locations as providing the material. You're seeing African kingdoms as being seen as points of comparison in terms of that which is wealthy, that which is powerful, and those which are sources of wealth as well. Okay? That's me running through that piece very, very quickly so I could get now to the Africans in the Bible. Where we are. So you can start to look now at some characters. There are quite a number of characters, and I just gave a representative sample of them that you'll find here. One of them, of course, is Moses' wife. And here I'm calling her Moses' wife because the source from which this comes doesn't give her a name. We know from Exodus, we know Moses' wife as Zipporah, named as Zipporah. But this source is Numbers 12. Numbers 12 basically gives this narrative of the people of Israel at a particular location. where Miriam and Aaron are having a conversation among themselves. And part of the conversation was, we don't know why this guy went and married that woman. And that woman is referred to as, depending on your translation, Cushite, Ethiopian, right? Nubian. It will be one of those, right? He got married to an African woman. Now again, of course, if even if we part of the one of the big things among all of us who grew up in the Christian church that we have to do, a big challenge is for us to stop thinking of the characters of the Bible as white. Right? All of us have that challenge, because that's the way we were socialized into thinking of them as white. But in any event, Aaron and Miriam are culturally different from who this woman is. And all Numbers 12 verse 1 does is just to give us that they were complaining about the fact that their brother got married to this woman. It didn't say what the source of the gripe was, etc., etc., etc. But you could spend time and read into it. We know that there's some cultural difference here. Of course, some people will go on to say, well, if Moses' wife was Cushite, therefore her father would have been, and start to connect names. I'm a little bit more careful here, because Exodus gives us names of those characters, Zipporah and Jethro. Numbers, I claimed as a different source, it doesn't mean that the wife that they're referring to in Numbers is the same wife that Exodus is referring to, because of course he could have had multiple wives. Okay? So that's one important thing. And this becomes important again in several instances, because again you get these myths that people talk about of sort of you get a sense of this monoculture rather than diversity. Many of the major men in the Bible had wives who were from a different culture. They weren't all Israelite, because that sort of a thing did happen as well. I think I have Hagar on the list, one who I insist over and over again in my work has to be seen as a wife of Abraham, rather than just somehow this woman that he got thing. But it presents to talk about Abraham and Hagar offers up a nice set of comparisons between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. If you understand the complexities of those of that relationship, it's an important point. But anyway, Hagar, Egyptian, right? Therefore, African is something we need to put in place. In Jeremiah meets a sad fate quite often, as you know. There are 3 times he is imprisoned. 1 time he's thrown into a pit, and with mud. This is a kind of a torture technique. We will put you into a pit with mud. You start to struggle. Of course, you start to sink deeper and deeper into it. You don't have food. You don't have water, etc., etc. That's his imprisonment, and he pleads with an official in the king's household called Ebed-Melech, who, again, the text tells us is an Ethiopian, a Cushite, a Nubian, right? One of the interesting things that I have found in translation, in coming upon this story, you would see translations of Ebed-Melech, right? Because his name says who he is, Eved. I'll come back to that word. And Melech means king. Now, the term Eved in Hebrew can either be servant or it can be slave. Okay? And in many of the translations, guess what he's called? It's called slave. Right? Now, here is this guy who on his own authority says, let's release Jeremiah. After the king imprisoned him. No song like somebody who is slave, right? But because Ethiopian, African, very easy to then create the conflation. he cannot be a man of power in the household. He has to be performing menial functions. And this becomes a very important way in which we have to, because again, many times with translations where you have to make the choice, is this person servant or is this person a slave? If depending upon where the person that is from, you will see translators defaulting one way or the other. If they think that the identities are piling up in one way to lead them to say slave, they go in that direction, which is like another thing for me with Haggai and the way Haggai is spoken about and the choices, the language that's being used, given the one word that we know with those. But in any way, here is Ebed-Melech, a servant. I would even go a little further to say a high official, because there's another word in the narrative that says he's a high official in the king's household, releasing Jeremiah. I want to jump to Acts chapter 8 as well, because this is another place where this happens. And it's the treasurer, the Ethiopian treasurer in Acts chapter 8. This is and the term that we have consistently is eunuch, right? So here's this guy who leaves his home in, Abyssinia, Ethiopia, right? And we know he is the treasurer to the queen of the kingdom. He's traveling, he goes to Jerusalem for the Passover, he's going back, he gets into the narrative, right? Like in all things, he's a side player in the narrative, because the story is focused upon Philip. And here's a big aside that I have. There is something I need to go look at. There's a guy who did this thing where he took major movies and he silenced all of the white characters in the movies, right? Just run the movie again, turn off all the voices of the white characters and the people of color. That's when he let them, you're hearing audio to make the point. Wow, look at it. See how these people appear in these movies. You see, I mean, how white voices predominate. This is what's happening in chapter 8 of Acts, where the story is not really about this Ethiopian, but it is about Philip. And yet, when we actually look at the story, what happens in the story is not an insignificant character, but a powerful royal official who brings Philip into some knowledge. So, if you remember the story, Philip is walking along the road and he sees this caravan come in, he flags him down, he's hitchhiking, jumps into the carriage with him, right? So here's this guy, remember, Ethiopia. He has his own caravan, he has his own driver, chauffeur, and all of that sort of stuff going his own way. Philip gets in and says, do you understand what you're reading? Now here's this guy, he's reading the scroll of Isaiah. Part of me says, no, remember, this is not the 20th century or the 19th century where Bibles are being mass-produced and everybody gets one, right? For someone to have the scroll of Isaiah, which could have been maybe more than one, but huge because it's one of the biggest books, right? This is not, I have a long ride, let me just pull up what I have on my Kindle. There is a great deal of intentionality on this man's part. And he's studying it. Right? Now, so part of me is the presumption of Philip to think, do you know what you're reading? Right? And he says, I'm struggling with this. No. I point out the part that the Ethiopian says he's struggling with is a part of Isaiah that has been a point of contention in biblical scholarship for years. The servant in Isaiah 52:53, he was wounded for our transgression. Who is the he That's there, right? And you will read any introductory Old Testament textbook, and we will pay attention to that, because some would say, oh, the he is probably whoever the king was, or it was some unknown character, or it was the servant, who's the identity of the servant, or it maybe was the nation of Israel, and then later on in the later period, oh, it's Jesus. All of those different things. That is not a settled question in the scholarship. So when the Ethiopian says, I don't understand this, it is not that he is uniquely ignorant. It is that he, like everyone else who has read the text intently and carefully, can't come to a easy conclusion. And it is through then this interaction with a dialogue, a partner, that this comes out. But when you look at the reading around this, it's Philip is educating him. One of the things that we'll find is when it becomes unavoidable to make the point about that this person is African in biblical texts, the conclusion tends to be, let's position them either as ignorant, as menial workers, right? All of the kind of a socially stereotypical views that Europeans have of Africans. That tends to lead the scholarship. And so you read Acts chapter 8, and Philip becomes the heroic figure rather than the treasurer. And it's important for me to say that if this guy left his home on a journey to go to Jerusalem for a Passover, he is more than an inquiring Jew. He's an ardent Jew. He has all of the signs of a practicing Jew. He is doing the pilgrimage as required. He is studying the ancient texts as required. He's doing all of the stuff. It's not on the sidelines. Which, of course, then gets you to Queen of Sheba, right? That story in Kings, that still today is very much alive within the ethos of Ethiopians as part of their national narrative, that her visit to Solomon, as recorded in the Bible, resulted in the conception of a child, and she returned to the kingdom of Sheba. Again, so if you hear Sheba, think in that same Cushite region, and you will see gold from Sheba and Seba will be brought to us. Isaiah has several of those. The Wealth of Nation Pieces has several of that. That comes up there. Again, so that the Queen of Sheba, again, one of the few queens that's mentioned in the Bible, African as well. And finally, I want to then say about Simon. Simon in Luke 14, and he is referred to as coming from the town of Cyrene, which is again another North African location in what we will call modern-day Libya. We do have instances of people from Cyrene in Acts chapter 2 who are part of the Pentecost. That list of place names in Acts chapter 2, Cyrene is one of those as well. You'll get the sense of, Judaism has spread throughout the region, and so there are Jews in North Africa and into the Cushite region as well as there in other places. Simon is the one, according to Luke, when Jesus is carrying the cross and Jesus falters and they press him, and he was just there minding his own business. His sons perhaps were living in Jerusalem or something or the other. Could they tell us who is the names of his sons? And he is the one in the story that Luke tells who helps Jesus with the cross until the final destination comes from Africa. So there are quite a number. But I want to go back to the essential point I started with, is first of all that we have to reconceptualize what we know about the geography. And understanding that the geography is not an innocent feature. It's not just, oh wow, this exists. The geographical imagination that we have is constructed, and it is constructed based upon largely ethnocentric European cultures. And that maps alongside of all the other kinds of social conditionings that we have. And those are the things that we take when we're reading the Bible. And therefore, what we have to do is to unpack those in order to see the place, the space of Africa within the Bible, and the African characters that come up as well. All right, so let me leave it there for now and give you a chance to interact with this material. We have about maybe close to 15 minutes, I think, of questions or comments. Yes.
So until now, I think people connect the Exodus story, and the slave experience in I'm going to say said Africa instead of Egypt, but Egypt with American slavery. I'm just wondering if there's any scholarship that connects Egypt with Africa with the Western or Christian, Judeo-Christian view of the normalization maybe of slavery, or just the presence of slavery as a justification for continued viewing Africa as the source of the slave experience.
Well, one of the things, of course, to begin with is that slavery is practiced in many cultures around the world, and from very early, I think in parts of Mesopotamia and Babylon, you're seeing instances of the practice of slavery, and there are different forms of it that would happen. The intriguing thing, though, there comes a point in time where Africans are seen as the right persons to be enslaved. 15th, 16th century, there's a debate, because by 15th, 16th century, you're seeing even among Europeans, in terms of economic forms of slavery, people who are debt slavery and all of that sort of a thing, they would enslave their own selves. The different sort of social groups in Europe, Tartans and other types who are it. But by the 16th century, particularly when the Spanish and the Portuguese get onto the issues of conquest in the Americas and further parts of Africa, that's when Africans start to emerge in the European imagination as the ideal slave type. And the interesting thing is, if there's a sort of a biblical warrant for that, it's not the Exodus story. It's, as I was saying earlier, it goes back to that Noah story in Genesis 9 and 10, the curse of Ham. Because what you have there is this word that says, you will be hewers of wood and drawers of water. And this thing of serving your brothers. Now, the idea of a younger brother serving the older brother is not new, is not unique to that particular space. Because you will see it in the 12 sons of story much later on in Genesis. But it becomes a very convenient justification for enslavement of Africans because of the links that were drawn much later on. So it was, you have the Table of Nations, which is providing a kind of a racial taxonomy, and then it goes back, oh, wow, Ham, Africans, oh, Ham, connected with that curse, therefore. So there are no links between the Exodus and the Egyptian sojourn and all of that sort of a thing in the justification of Africans and enslavement. What you have, on the other hand, is enslaved Africans who use it as a means of liberation. That's the link that you would see, is the overturning of the justifications for enslavement rather than the other way around. They go to Genesis for that.
Do they still categorize Africans? Meaning, I was taught once that Ethiopians were considered Semitic and not Negroid. Is this still something you see?
Yeah, because this is the thing about racial categories, that they're very malleable and they're elastic, and you could stretch them and that sort of a thing. The question that I think that you're raising And what you're hearing is tens now. What are at what point in time are we dealing with? Okay, because I'm very gentle about using the language race within the biblical sense, because it doesn't exist in the way we understand it. We understand it today, and I would more or less pay attention to the fact of the origins of people, and I'm using the very broad term Africans as a sort of a geographical and ethnic designation in some ways. The issue tends to be that, yes, what you have had, because we're talking about hundreds and thousands of years of history, so there is no stable set of features and identities. So at some point in time, you depending upon where you come, you have Ethiopians who may want to self-identify, to lean into their Jewish origins as being Semitic, right? So you do see traces of that. The question would be, how do they now self-identify, whether or not? I know by the end of the 19th century, Ethiopia becomes equivalent to Africans. The term, not that Ethiopians, but the term Ethiopia becomes Africans. Africans and Ethiopia is very interchangeable. You'll see it in Southern Africa towards the end of the 19th century, and you'll see it a lot in the Americas. In parts of the US, you will see the term Ethiopia being used synonymously as Africans, as Africa. So it's dicey, right? Depending upon the claim you want to make.
Actually, then I remember the poet Paul Laurence Dunbar, when he, at the opening of the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, he read "Ode to Ethiopia" was the poem he created for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, you'll see that in many places. There's and you see it in churches. Savannah, Georgia, First Ethiopian Church, First Ethiopian Baptist Church. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's hard. You're definitely putting me on the spot. You're definitely putting me on the spot here. So this is, and you notice how gently I just use the term African, very, very broadly. Are they not? So here's what I know very, very clearly. I think it's the 14th or the 16th dynasty in Egypt. They're taken over by Nubians, right? Sudanese, modern-day Sudanese, etc., etc. And why I know this as a biblical scholar? It's because of the issues around Joseph, the stories of Joseph as a leader in thing. Can someone who is not Egyptian rise to such a powerful position in Egypt? And the 14th or 16th dynasty was led by outsiders, by Nubians, who eventually infiltrated, migrated, assimilated, did all of these other things, right? So the sense is, yes, then what you're seeing are very black, dark-skinned people as Egyptians. That one I know very clearly. Are they all that? Is that the phenotype? I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I do know that there are many people who make the claim that they were. Right? And what I would accept as well is that let us not make judgments based upon what we see today. That's very, very clear to me, because there's been a lot of movement. I want to pay attention, though, to the advancing technology that will help provide some of those answers.
Yeah. But I mean, you know the story about the Italian soldier who shot the nose off the Sphinx?
Yes. yes.
And they think that was maybe 12,000 years ago.
Right, yeah. Right, yeah. Okay.
I was wondering if you went to the Caravans of Gold exhibit that was at the Block Museum about medieval Africa that was there last year.
No, I wasn't able to. When I went into that space, I saw that it was there, and I was like, oh gosh, missed it.
And ask if they've had any application to your scholarship, so, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I missed it. Yeah, quite a few things that I missed. Once again? Yeah? Okay, over here.
I hope you don't mind, I'm going to share this, Robert, but Robert once said to me, if the Holy Family went to Egypt to escape, and they were welcomed, wouldn't you think that their own skin would be fairly dark? Or was the culture of that as a refuge place such that they were much more open to people of other skin tones and cultural backgrounds than our country is right now?
Yeah, it's the same question that comes up. I don't know if this is behind your thing with Moses. How could Moses pass as an Egyptian? Unless Israelites and Egyptians were phenotypically the same or fairly similar, right? That, and I think there are many other things. One of the things I think I would want to give space for is the sense that the ancient world was much better, I don't want to say perfect, was much better at holding diversity than we are today. All right, of creating an understanding that, with some exceptions. I find Egyptian culture very fascinating from this vantage point, in the sense that Egyptian culture is open and yet not very permeable, very resistant. All of the empires and civilizations from the ancient world, Egypt is the one that remained strong. And so, there's the theory that what sustains Egypt is the River Nile, the constant flow. The Mesopotamian civilizations went up and down because they were reliant upon not very strong rivers. Tigris and Euphrates were kind of seasonal, whereas the was. So that there's an openness to Egyptian culture, but at the very same time there's resistance. Persians can't really control it and infiltrate it. The Greeks can't either. In fact, Persian leaders had to take on the title of pharaoh. That sort of a thing. So I want to think that Egypt is in some ways very hospitable and open to welcoming, in one sense, and housing, being able to house diversities in ways we perhaps cannot imagine or can't appreciate. Yet at the very same time, the stories of atrocities that you might want to hear could easily well take place. So it could also be a place of intolerance where that happens. The challenge that we have is that because of the way race is constructed in the modern way, and we are aware of this, most scholars are aware of this, race becomes in many ways a sort of a visual feature. What do you look like? What are your facial features? What's your hair? What's your skin color? It's all of those very same thing. And that's either a very explicit or implicit way in which we think about race. And that makes it a little bit hard to reconstruct, unless we do have some visual images. And as I think Bernal was pointing to, look at the images, look at the Grecian art, and you could see what's going on. And those we know, and those we can see. But again, it's a window through an elite portion of the culture. So are we seeing everyday people? Are we seeing a broad view of the entire population or not? But the questions are important. Those are important questions, and I don't think that they're out of order. And in other words, for me, when you raise questions like those, it's an acknowledgement that you understand how cultural and other kinds of differences exist within the biblical text, rather than trying to erase them or pretend that they're not there or homogenize those those differences. That's, you know, so even though we might not be able to fully answer them, having them to disturb our thinking is very important.
Well, let's give them a round of applause.
All right.